I think it's fair to assume that what we think are closed source or proprietary models will in fact not be, because they will have been stolen at some point. And so we're kidding ourselves, I worry, if we think that we can truly keep these things secret. I'd really favor an approach that just leans into our advantage, because if we operate from a position of fear, where we try to lock down the doors and batten down the hatches, and this is the way we're going to retain our competitiveness, I actually think we're going to lose.
Welcome back to Turpentine VC, a podcast where we discuss the art and science of building successful venture firms, VC to VC. In today's episode, I sit down with Roelof Botha, the managing partner of Sequoia Capital, and Jacob Helberg, author, Palantir advisor, and founder of the Hill and Valley Conference, which bridges technologists and DC policymakers. This conversation goes into the role the US government has played in the growth of the tech industry, Sequoia's split from its China and India entities, the future of AI regulation, and the importance of open source versus proprietary tech models.
Roelof, Jacob, welcome. Stoked to be interviewing you both. So the Hill and Valley Conference was a massive success. Why don't we first start with you, Roelof? Why did Sequoia decide to join this year?
Well, before we get into that, I want to say a big thank you to Jacob, because he deserves the credit for bringing together Silicon Valley and DC. There's a multi-decade history between Silicon Valley and the US government writ large. I don't think people always appreciate how much of what Silicon Valley became was thanks to a significant amount of government spending on basic research and development for the development of semiconductors and the internet and everything else. And so that seemed to have softened, I'd say, maybe a decade ago. And it's wonderful to see somebody like Jacob step up to rekindle these conversations, where people from DC and Silicon Valley can get together, as the name suggests, Hill and Valley, for us to get together in the same room and find out that we actually have much more in agreement than may have been apparent from a distance. So I wanted to say that off the bat. The reason we showed up, when I joined Sequoia shortly after the PayPal exit, I think there were about 200 million people on the planet that had access to the internet. And today there are obviously measures in the billions. And so technology has infused our lives way more extensively than I think any of us could have imagined 20 years ago. And so I just think it's kind of quaint and maybe outdated for Silicon Valley to imagine that it doesn't have a big role in society at large. And so it's imperative for people from Silicon Valley to show up and have a voice in the debate in DC, as technology shapes so much of our lives. And if we're not present, we're not able to have a proper conversation that's fully informed to make sure we have sound policy that enables the US to continue to thrive and be competitive on a global stage.
Yeah, that's well said. Jacob, I want to turn it over to you. You've done a few of these summits now, and this was a massive success. Major sort of contributions from both sides in terms of people who presented. We had even former President Trump submit some notes of encouragement. Why don't you talk about how attitudes have changed both on Capitol Hill and Silicon Valley as these last few years, as you've been a bridge between the two?
Yeah. So first of all, I just wanted to start by thanking Roelof for his incredibly kind and generous words. And Erik, if I could just build a little bit on that first question you asked, which was about Sequoia's participation in Silicon Valley, and just add a couple of points to what Roelof said and say that a core mission of the Hill and Valley Forum is to promote the partnership between Silicon Valley and Capitol Hill to make sure America has the best technological capabilities in the world. And in my view, we can't fulfill that mission well without having the very best players from both sides at the table. And my boss at Palantir, Alex Karp, has a saying that if you are trying to treat a sick patient, you want the best surgeon on your side. And I kind of view this through the same lens. And so I think, for the Hill and the Valley Forum to be a success, we want the best innovators and the best venture capital investors, coupled with the most thought-provoking and committed policymakers. And so I was incredibly excited when Roelof said that he was interested in joining, because Sequoia obviously plays an instrumental role in Silicon Valley and has been at the forefront of innovation. And so it was a real treat to have him join us at the Hill and Valley Forum this year.
That's awesome. Well articulated. Why don't we segue to the second question, which was, how have you seen attitudes evolve since you've been doing this work of bridging?
So when I first started going through the intellectual exercise of taking notes on the relationship between Washington and Silicon Valley, my work to some extent started when I worked on the policy team at Google. And I saw two things. The first is that the relationship between Silicon Valley and Washington had grown somewhat fraught over the years with an enormous amount of distrust. And there was a pretty noticeable cultural disconnect. Part of that distrust stemmed from an unfortunate series of events that ranged from the fallout of the Snowden leaks, which caused a huge amount of international backlash against large Silicon Valley companies. And the second was various events from Project Maven to Project Dragonfly, which got a lot of press and attention, which caused a lot of policymakers in Washington to distrust Silicon Valley. The other thing I noticed is that a lot of the people in Washington from Silicon Valley who were getting the most airtime and attention were executives from the biggest technology companies. But at the time, I lived in the Bay Area and I saw that there was a whole vibrant technology ecosystem in the Valley that was getting no attention and exposure to Washington. And so one of the byproducts of this is that a lot of people in DC had kind of pessimistically grown to believe that our best and brightest engineers are focused on optimizing advertising technology, while our adversaries in China are focused on building hypersonic technology and hard, what people call hard tech. But I knew that wasn't true because I saw every day founders undertaking big risks and trying to solve hard engineering problems. And so ultimately, I wrote a book that came out in 2021 that had an entire chapter devoted to the rift between the hill and the valley. And a byproduct of that work ended up materializing in building out a conference and ultimately a community to bring these two communities together and to try to bridge that cultural gap. And the cultural gap is real. I mean, in Washington, people in Congress approach problems from a legal background. Most stakeholders are in their 60s. In Silicon Valley, people are on average about 20 years younger. They have an engineering background. So people approach the same set of facts with different worldviews and life experiences. But fundamentally, they're both in the business of building the future. And I was really passionate about helping serve as a bridge between these two critically important communities.
That's well said. Roelof, I want to turn to you. I'm curious, where are you guys at Sequoia bullish on defense and frontier tech? Where are you bullish and where are you concerned?
Well, the job I have is actually a lot of fun because I just get to listen to the smartest entrepreneurs, and that's what we follow. And so, fortunately, founders see the future before the rest of us. That's their special gift. And what we at Sequoia try to do is help them realize that ambition and make that future a reality. And so we've seen more and more of our entrepreneurs, partly for good company building reasons, sometimes for good patriotic reasons, want to address opportunities in and around defense technology. So we're an investor in SpaceX, which obviously has a huge influence on defense for the United States. I mean, SpaceX now accounts for 80% of all mass into orbit globally. It's bigger than all the other countries put together. And if it hadn't been for what Elon had done at SpaceX, the US would be lagging significantly. And if you think about control of the space race, that's a huge, huge element of our national defense. And obviously, I have a long history with Elon. He recruited me at PayPal many, many moons ago. We also partnered with a company called Mach. Jacob earlier talked about hypersonics. It's a little bit sad, actually. It was DARPA funding that helped the US develop hypersonic technology. And unfortunately, we didn't develop it enough. The US Air Force didn't take up that opportunity. The IP was stolen, appropriated. And today, our adversaries have far more hypersonic capabilities than we do. And so we backed a company called Mach. Ethan, the founder, was actually at the Hill and Valley Forum. And they're building hydrogen-powered hypersonic missile systems and defense systems for the US government. So we're thrilled to be in business with them. We also have a long history on cybersecurity, which is obviously a big domain where some of the battleground is being played out. And so whether that dates back to our investment in Palo Alto Networks back in 2005, we've partnered with companies like Wiz and Oasis more recently that are providing cloud infrastructure, cybersecurity solutions, or solutions for non-human identity, for, machine security, if you will. And so we continue to see these opportunities. We have two more investments that we've already closed, but they're still in stealth. And so we're super excited. Actually, earlier today, we just approved another investment in the defense space. So, it's wonderful that the founders are finding their way here, and we are eager to help them build great businesses.
Jacob, I want to pass it over to you. You've been very vocal about why we should ban TikTok here, and you've been very influential, perhaps the most influential in helping make that happen, or steps towards that happen. Do you think we're in a new arms race with China?
I do. I do think we're in a new arms race with China. And, for a long time, I was very concerned that that meant too many elements in Silicon Valley were trying to remain neutral and be Switzerland. The business of geopolitics is not core to the day-to-day work that draws most founders to wanting to build a company. So I think a lot of entrepreneurs understandably prefer staying away from being in the middle of a geopolitical rivalry. With that being said, I think, part of what has happened in the mid 2010s was a lot of companies that tried to remain neutral in this deepening geopolitical rivalry in practice ended up creating a policy of equidistance where they were trying to essentially balance competing priorities with Beijing and Washington. And I wrote an article in 2020 that said Silicon Valley can't be neutral in the US-China Cold War, and that approach would be untenable. I'm very, very happy that I think we've turned a corner. And I think, generally speaking, there is actually broad consensus today in Silicon Valley that the relationship between the US and China is in a place where it requires companies to take a side in a less ambiguous way. And so I'm happy that I do think today the era of Silicon Valley's neutrality is over. And we are seeing, to Roelof's point, we're seeing this incredibly inspiring, growing ecosystem of tech founders who are willingly answering Uncle Sam's call and solving some of the hardest engineering problems, from hypersonic technology to biosciences and artificial intelligence. All of these hard technologies and frontier technologies are inherently dual use. And it's incredibly important that our very best founders focus on the hardest problems possible. And ultimately, I think it's incumbent on the US government to do a better job at reaching out to the Bay Area to help convert our best private innovations into hard power.
Roelof, I was just giving Jacob a lot of well-deserved credit for his advocacy work, but you also, and your firm deserve credit for being very open about separating from the Chinese Sequoia entity, focusing your efforts in the US and in Europe. Can you explain the status of that separation, to what degrees you're still connected to that firm, and why you thought this was in the best interests of the US and Sequoia?
Sure. We embarked on an expansion period starting around 2005. And this was shortly after China was admitted to the World Trade Organization. And I think the general sentiment in the West was that economic integration would lead to sort of normalization and an embrace of Western democratic values. And that's, the US and government explicitly encouraged investment in and development of economic ties with China. And it obviously led to an amazing, rise from poverty for, hundreds of millions of people. So we opened up offices in India, Southeast Asia, and China. We did set them up as separate entities that were managed by separate teams, separate decision-making, separate funds that were raised independently. And what we shared was a brand and back office functions like finance and compliance and IT, if you will. And obviously, the world has changed. Some of the data I've been looking at recently, world trade in goods as a percentage of global GDP peaked in 2008. 2008, more than 15 years ago. And so we're in this period right now where you see more economic nationalism. And it's a very different period from this sort of post-Second World War 70-year golden period that we've enjoyed. And we need to recognize that reality. And so, we're not blind to geopolitical pressures, obviously, and honestly, there were challenges in running this very distributed global organization, yet that they were separate entities. And so we all got together last year. we agreed that it was better for us to go our separate ways. We announced that in June 2023, and by the end of last year, the full separation was complete. What was Sequoia China is now called Hongshan. What used to be Sequoia India is now Peak 15, and we are fully independent, separate brands at this point.
Hey, we'll continue our interview in a moment after a word from our sponsors. Today, I want to make a bit of a personal appeal to anyone working on a SaaS app or website. If you spend any time on the internet, you probably have interacted with chatbots in the bottom right corner of sites. Most are really annoying. AI is making them better, but still I often just get really useless generic answers out of these and end up just wanting to talk to a real human. It felt to me like AI shouldn't just make chatbots marginally better at text responses, but that they should enable a new type of web assistant, something that feels like you're talking to a human support agent who is co-browsing alongside you. CommandBar is building that user assistant. Companies embed it into their web app, mobile app, or website, and they get a fully generative chatbot that can give personalized responses that refer to a user's past chats, perform actions directly on behalf of the user, like looking up account info, and even start browsing alongside the user to show them how to do something, like a tour guide. It can also nudge users when they seem confused or frustrated. I love when I encounter CommandBar in websites. It's white labeled, but at this point I can tell right away. CommandBar already reaches more than 20 million end users with major customers like HashiCorp, Gusto, Freshworks, 6 Sense, and more. See for yourself at commandbar.com/MOZ or follow the link in the show notes. Hey all, I'm hearing more and more that founders want to get profitable and do more with less, especially with engineering. Listen, I love your 30-year-old ex-FANG senior software engineer as much as the next guy, but honestly, I can't afford them anymore. Founders everywhere are trying to turn to global talent, but boy, is it a hassle to do at scale, from sourcing to interviewing to on-the-ground operations and management. That's why I teamed up with Sean Lanahan, who's been building engineering teams in Vietnam at a very high level for over 5 years to help you access global engineering without the headache. Squad, Sean's new company, takes care of sourcing, legal compliance, and local HR for global talent so you don't have to. With teams across Asia and South America, we can cover you no matter which time zone you operate in. Their engineers follow your process and use your tools. They work with React, Next.js, or your favorite front-end frameworks. And on the back end, they're experts at Node, Python, Java, and anything under the sun. Full disclosure, it's going to cost more than the random person you found on Upwork that's doing 2 hours of work per week but billing you for 40. But you'll get premium quality at a fraction of the typical cost. Our engineers are vetted top 1% talent and actually working hard for you every day. Increase your velocity without amping up burn. Head to choosesquad.com and mention Turpentine to skip the waitlist.
Jacob, is what's happening with TikTok a bellwether for more technological decoupling between the US and China?
I think it is. And, to echo some of the points that Roelof was making, I think the arc that Roelof described, where in the early to mid 2000s, the prevailing consensus was deeper integration with China was good for the world and good for America, was as true in the private sector as it was in the public sector, where, to Roelof's point, it was official US policy for a long time to promote deeper regional and international integration. And so, part of, in a lot of ways, the changes that we've seen a number of different companies make to decide to look to other markets outside of China, and to, some companies have adopted a build where you sell model, whatever the recalibration in, a given company's approaches, but to adapt to this new landscape. We've actually seen that same process take place in the policymaking community. And the TikTok bill is actually a reflection of that, where, TikTok was allowed to operate in the US for a long time. Huawei wasn't an issue until the mid 2010s. So was ZTE. DJI is a topic of discussion and is still allowed in the US, although, is undergoing a lot of scrutiny. And so, if you zoom out, I think you're seeing a lot of policymakers go through that same process of recalibration of how they think, public policy should be recalibrated to factor in the fact that the world has changed, and therefore updating, the policy approach is warranted. And I think that, the TikTok legislation is ultimately an important overdue recalibration of our technology trading relationship with China. And it was a hugely important precedent and bellwether for how we approach other technology issues. And ultimately, I've been a big proponent of the United States government thinking through in a holistic way what should our technology trading relationship as a whole be with China. I think, I would favor a holistic approach rather than a piecemeal approach. And I think you're kind of seeing that take place, bit by bit, whether it's debate that's going on with ZTE, Huawei, TikTok, DJI. I think, the Trump campaign announced that, it would consider the imposition of tariffs on electric vehicles. So you're seeing a 360 recalibration of our technology trading relationship. And ultimately, I think given where the world is in 2024, I think it's a healthy thing.
Roelof, is there anything you wanted to add to that?
No, just having studied economics as an undergrad, along with statistics and math, I was always a big fan of Ricardo's view of the benefits of trade, and the problem obviously is that it makes simplifying assumptions about the interests of the trading partners, and that everybody serves a common good, has a certain sense of values around respect for intellectual property, human rights, and things like that. And so I'm reminded of this one joke that at some point, if you're playing a sport, let's just say you're playing soccer, if the one side is winning because they keep going offside to score goals, at some point you sort of have to say, listen, can we just recalibrate? It's not the way we're all playing. So I think this is a very healthy dynamic that we're having these conversations.
Yes, yeah, I didn't learn that. The sophistication that we're talking about now, I didn't learn that in my econ classes as well.
And Eric, just to build a little bit on what Roelof just said, I think one of the reasons why having open lines of communication between Capitol Hill and Silicon Valley is so important is because I think everyone in DC understands that, being autarkic and reshoring everything to the United States is obviously not realistic. And so actually for policymakers need to be able to get feedback from technology executives in the Valley in order to basically say, okay, our objective, China is abrasive to American security interests. We need to reduce our dependence on them from a supply chain standpoint and from a data security standpoint. What is the best realistic way to achieve that objective? And getting that feedback from technology executives who understand their supply chains, who understand the technology stack and the architecture of complicated platforms is actually incredibly valuable. And policymakers can then, with that feedback, do a better job at actually implementing a trade agenda, whether it's with countries like Vietnam or India or other markets, in order to provide the scale that companies need to develop great products and groundbreaking technologies while addressing the security concerns that policymakers have.
And maybe just to add to that, in addition to the security concerns, there's just basic rule of law around IP, intellectual property. I mean, I'm involved personally with at least 3 software businesses where our software was blatantly stolen, and we're not able to build businesses in China because we can't enforce our property rights. And so we're in a situation where these companies have spent, in some cases over the last decade, $1 billion in R&D spend to build world-class software in certain domains, and yet we're not able to access a certain market where our software gets taken, appropriated, and used to build businesses by rivals who didn't have to make that R&D spend. It's a little bit like me stealing somebody's factory, not having to pay for all that capex and claiming I'm a low-cost producer. It's like, no, it's because you stole something. So there is something fundamentally unfair about the way that trade is conducted, and I don't think one should tolerate that kind of unfair behavior from a trading partner, beyond the national security issues, which obviously are even more important.
Yeah, absolutely. And Peter Thiel actually had an interesting observation once upon a time that the US and China, in some ways, are playing a different game where because China's population is roughly 4 times larger than the US, for parity means America is already losing technology parity. Because if they manage to fully catch up to us technologically, their economy could be 4 times our size just by virtue of the size of their population. And so for us, it's actually even more important for us to stay ahead than it is for them. And it's, building on what Roelof said, it's incredibly important for us to be judicious to close down the pathways of IP that the Chinese have been able to exploit to carry out IP theft, which at the scale of the US economy amounts to hundreds of billions of dollars. And the former head of Cybercom actually referred to it as the biggest transfer of wealth in human history, which is, obviously hyperbolic, but he was making a point that the scale was significant.
It's really interesting, Jacob. To that point, it feels like we've finally you've been calling these warnings or warning for years, and it seems like people are finally starting to listen and take this threat seriously. But if you knew what you know now and could go back to say 2010 or something like that, because it feels like it seems like we had all these expectations or hopes that not only would China liberalize, they'd play fair, that we had expectations for them to do all these things that they ended up not doing or acting in ways that we didn't expect and anticipate. And if we knew that they were going to act in this way, what would you have recommended that we do differently, or what could have we done differently that would have set us up in a much better position?
I mean, I think moving along the debate about strategic technological decoupling, could have happened sooner. I think there was already evidence of China's nefarious behavior. I don't think I had, necessarily had a crystal ball. I think I was just paying closely attention to the pattern of China's nefarious behavior in a way that wasn't getting a lot of attention at the time. But ultimately, I'm, grateful that people have been absorbing information with an open mind, and that, when presented with evidence, a lot of people kind of evolve their views. And I think that's a healthy thing. I think you want that debate to happen. I mean, my basic approach over the last few years has been engaging in conversations with almost everyone willing to listen. And I think it's, one of the great things about our democracy is that you can have these Socratic dialogues and, based on the merits of an idea, let the best argument win. And if an argument is compelling, people are open to it, and, we'll take that feedback. And I think it's great that the consensus has, evolved in the way that it has. And I think ultimately we're landing in the right place, which is good news.
Well said. I want to zoom out and talk about the AI supply chain. How are export controls affecting tech?
Roelof, do you have thoughts on I'm curious, have people in the Bay Area been talking at all about export controls, and is this a topic of discussion in the startup ecosystem?
Yeah, export controls in of themselves are not. I think there's some of the things that are topical in Silicon Valley are CFIUS, so the ability for foreign countries or people, particularly China, to be able to make investments in the United States. Those rules have existed for a while. There's a question of whether or not they're sufficient given the changes that have happened, and also whether existing ownership gets reassessed. If an investment happened 3 years ago in what today is deemed sensitive, should those be reassessed rather than just forgotten about? So that's a contemporary conversation. And then I think increasingly investors in Silicon Valley are loath to invest in China. Now, I'll say that in some pockets, one of the phrases I heard was many people are concerned about a return of investment rather than a return on investment because of what has happened in China. And in fact, you're seeing a big tide of Chinese investors actually investing in Europe and the United States because the opportunity set in China has shrunk, given how capricious the government has been and how involved the CCP has been in so many of the leading private and public technology companies. So that's an ongoing debate. When it comes to export control, I think the way I think about it maybe is in the context of AI in particular, where we need to have something that's the equivalent of energy independence. I think the US would have been in a truly precarious position, if you think about what's unfolded over the last decade, if we hadn't cracked fracking and been as energy independent as we are now. And people here are very apprehensive about a future in which we may not have AI independence. And that goes all the way from, the semiconductors that you need, the data centers that are used to build foundational models, and also then to run inference. the software models that are built for those, the applications that are developed. And right now, I don't think we can claim full independence. Certainly with semiconductor dependence on manufacturing in Taiwan is obviously a huge exposure point. And I think people here are very eager to see the redevelopment of key nodes of manufacturing capability within the United States. And so that is certainly a very, very hot topic here in Silicon Valley.
And I think in DC, I think those observations from Silicon Valley are actually incredibly interesting because a lot of time and attention in Washington has been very focused on chip production, but less attention has been drawn to other parts of the AI supply chain and the technology ecosystem. I think, the trend that you pointed out, Roelof, of an increased level of Chinese capital in the US tech ecosystem is actually underappreciated in the policymaking community, as well as this concept of AI independence. I think is incredibly interesting and is in keeping with some of the things that we've seen. For example, KV invest in an Indian based version of OpenAI based on the basic thesis that different large countries will want their own quote unquote sovereign AI capabilities. And so I think this concept of AI independence is actually a really interesting one for people in the policymaking space to study and become more literate about, especially in light of what's going on in the UAE right now, where the UAE, which is obviously a very energy rich country, has committed to investing billions in large computing clusters. And if it's obviously their right to do that, and our companies should be free to create partnerships with them to build out the infrastructure, because if we don't, the Chinese will fill the void. But I think we need to think about and be deliberate about, do we want our companies to start being reliant on the compute capacity of a foreign partner like the UAE, or do we want to implement investments here in the US that allows us to have a domestic compute capacity that allows us to have the best AI models in the world? And because I am a little bit concerned that if we don't upgrade our energy grid and if we don't make the kinds of investments in both the energy infrastructure as well as the computing infrastructure that we need, that 5, 6, 7 years down the line, a lot of our largest AI companies are going to be heavily reliant on computing infrastructure that's going to be abroad. And we're going to be having the same conversations about the AI supply chain that we're currently having with the old school supply chain of manufacturing, everything from devices to toys to electric vehicles. So I think now that industry is at a stage of infancy where we can be more deliberate about it, and it's great to be able to help animate those discussions.
Just to make it concrete, by the way, today data centers in America consume about 2% of electricity. The current projections, based on the energy demands of building these models and then implementing them, actually having them run inference, is that it'll grow from 2 to 6%. Adding 4% of US electricity capacity is significant. And right now, it takes something in the order of 4.5 years just to complete the environmental impact study for a new plant, whether independent of the nature of it. And so I know that a couple of new small nuclear reactors have been approved, but I'd really encourage us to move as quickly as possible to ensure that we have the kind of electricity capacity we need. I mean, it's one of the best predictors of GDP growth is your ability to sustain energy production. And we have the means to do clean energy. Solar has become inexpensive enough. Nuclear technology exists. We just need to sort of get out of our own way, having regulated it almost out of existence.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And this is a topic that I hope to help elevate a little bit more in DC because I think it's incredibly important.
To that end, I want to segue and talk about regulation. Maybe, Roelof, we'll start with you. What are your views on AI regulation, and should our approach be? What does it look like to get it right, and what do we have to avoid in terms of not getting it wrong?
Part of the beauty of the American system is actually regulation. And I first got to Stanford Business School, there was a professor, Paul Romer, who gave a class, and he was trying to explain to us that it was these foundational regulatory frameworks of the United States that enabled capitalism to flourish. And as a fresh business school student, I was baffled. It's like, what do you mean? And he would describe things like the Chapter 7 process in America being so much more efficient than the bankruptcy processes in other countries, which frees up people and capital and buildings to be redeployed to new things. So I think in general, I think I can imagine how often people in Silicon Valley just have an immediate disdain, sort of an instinctive knee-jerk reaction that regulation per se is bad. That's not the case. Sound regulation enables our country to flourish. And I think when it comes to AI, we have both an opportunity and a risk. The risk is that we get it wrong and we squander what is one of the best opportunities for us to propel economic growth in this country for decades to come. That's the opportunity at hand. So we need to be very careful to seize this opportunity by making sure that policy focuses, in my mind, on the application rather than the foundational technology. Because to regulate AI as a foundational capability is like regulating electricity or the internal combustion engine sort of as an abstract innovation without regard for its actual implementation. And so, in my mind, that's where we should focus. And I'll give you some examples. I'm on the board of a financial services company where we offer loans to small businesses and to consumers. And there are very well developed laws and rules in the United States for fair lending practices. And whether you were using sort of primitive statistical techniques or early machine learning models a decade ago or the latest AI model, you should be tested and we need to make sure that the lending practices are fair based on US regulation. That's independent of regulating the underlying model, whether it was a machine learning model or a so-called modern generative AI model. So I think that's where we need to focus. I'm a little bit worried that Europe is sort of jumping ahead with regulation a bit more aggressively than it should, and that they may inadvertently starve what is a great opportunity. I'll be honest with you, the Hill and Valley Forum to me was a great example of this, and I was in DC in February as well. When I've spoken to people in Capitol Hill, they are eager to listen. They're eager to engage not only with the leading companies, but as Jacob said earlier, they also want to hear from the small companies and the academics. There were several professors who were at the Hill and Valley Forum last week because they want to engage in these policy discussions. And it's also a bipartisan effort. It was truly amazing for me to see how many people from across the aisle are just engaged in trying to think about these issues, wrestle with them, and try to get to the right answer. So I'm very optimistic that we're going about it in the right way and that we're going to land in the right place.
And just second what Roelof said, I think he hit the nail on the head when he, suggested focusing on the end application of how the technology is used rather than the technology itself. He used the example of electricity, which is obviously an excellent example. Another figure of speech that I use a lot of the times in my interactions with policymakers is I compare it to steel, where you can use steel to build a machine gun or a hospital, but a machine gun and a hospital shouldn't be regulated the same way. And so when I see some of the discussions that I've been hearing in DC, I'm a little bit concerned that there has been too much emphasis on regulating the technology itself through the creation of a whole new agency that tries to do licensing and auditing. I would prefer seeing an end use approach and a sector by sector basis where regulation of AI in transportation doesn't look the same as it does in healthcare or in biomedical research and so forth. And so I'm strongly in favor of a sector-based approach and an end-use approach of AI governance. I think there's a lot of the benefit of that approach is that it also grounds the approach in legal precedent. So if you take AI in the transportation sector, for example, some of the canonical policy questions that people have asked is, if you have an autonomous car and the car hits someone, who's liable? Is it the AI company, the auto manufacturer? And you can actually use a lot of legal precedent and our corpus of tort law to develop an answer to these policy questions that has legal precedent and that's coherent relative to answers that we have already developed that related to adjacent questions for that industry. And so I think it's ultimately the right approach. AI in the military sector, for example, we have laws about export control, about the transfer of sensitive technologies abroad. And we also, have a whole policy agenda that's aimed at having the best military technology out there. And so I think if you start thinking about it through an end use sector based approach, it moves the policy conversation to a much more rational place than if you focus on creating an entirely new agency that is going to start to become the arbiter of AI unfairness or whatever the policy definitions are.
To that end, I want to go deeper into the open versus closed debate. We had Mark Andreessen and Vinod Khosla taking opposite sides of that perspective, and very smart people disagree on whether we should be encouraging open source or not. Why don't we hear both sides of that argument in terms of you guys weighing in?
I'm a big fan of open source software. There's so much of the software products we enjoy today that would not exist if it weren't for open source technologies. When I was at PayPal, we were paying huge amounts of money to buy Sun servers because we had to run Oracle as our database. We had to build our own data center capacity, rack and stack our own servers. I mean, it was a very different business. When I partnered with the YouTube founders back in 2005, they were able to use MySQL and Memcache and a bunch of other open source technologies. And it was the beginning of the cloud. And it just made it so much easier for them to build a really compelling business, which today obviously serves a big part of the global audience every single day. And so for me, open source is subject to scrutiny because it's open by definition. Other people can inspect the code. Sunlight is ultimately the best disinfectant. And so you can expose vulnerabilities. You can have academics pressure test it. And so I'm a huge fan of us continuing to nurture an open source ecosystem in around AI in particular. There's another piece here, which is of the top models, Alibaba has one of the top 15 models in the world that is open source now. So there's a risk that if the US does not provide open source or support open source technologies in AI, other countries will. And what you may end up with is that the next developer in Southeast Asia, Latin America, Eastern Europe, Africa, building an application is using a model that was developed in one of our adversaries' markets that's going to give very different answers to the ones we think are the right answers about questions like what happened at Tiananmen Square. And so we've got to think about that future, because if we don't provide those open source technologies ourselves, others will will fill that void. And I don't think that's a future that we want. So I'm a huge fan of open source. I also support the companies that want to build proprietary models. If you look at many of the other software categories that we invest in around infrastructure software, there are thriving businesses providing proprietary software on databases or on data warehouses or sort of various other pieces of the enterprise infrastructure stack. And both open source and closed source companies are able to thrive. And I think we should enable that same ecosystem to flourish in and around the AI space.
And I think from the policy standpoint, I think people in DC are still making up their minds about what the right approach is. I actually think, this is partly that debate was actually one of the reasons that we decided to do daytime sessions this year, was because it's a debate policymakers really want to hear the pros and cons about from technology builders. Obviously, the argument against open source is, we need to try to stop China from getting access to our most sensitive capabilities and slow them down, whether it's through a light touch approach like a know your customer rule or, other types of rules. But, the argument that Roelof, the argument in favor of open source, which traces back to the one Roelof just described, is also interesting and compelling, where at the end of the day, open source software could become an incredibly powerful platform technology that a lot of other companies from other countries and end up building on. And so, to Roelof's point, if we start making open source harder, will that create a vacuum that will be filled by companies like Alibaba and, other Chinese companies. And so it's actually really useful to get, to hear the pros and cons from technology builders, because people in DC haven't themselves made up their minds. And so thinking through, what the trade-offs are is incredibly interesting and useful.
But Jacob, just to interject for a second, I think given the history of state-sponsored intellectual property theft against US companies, I think it's fair to assume that what we think are closed source or proprietary models will in fact not be, because they will have been stolen at some point. And so we're kidding ourselves, I worry, if we think that we can truly keep these things secret. And I'd almost point to the opposite. I mean, part of the reason people live in cities or congregate in cities is ideas reverberate very fast. And your competitive advantage is actually not that you have the idea, but that your idea improves faster than it does elsewhere. And in my mind, our ability to sustain open source in the US will enable us to learn faster than anywhere else. And that reverberation that we benefit from as ideas are shared between our brightest minds will be the sustainable advantage. Another example is it's not just the development of the core technology, but its implementation. Intel's blueprints for the microchip were stolen by Russia decades ago. Yet they never were able to build a fab that rivaled, what we built in the US. And so I think we should be, and it's not really advocating, obviously, but I think I'd really favor an approach that just leans into our advantage. Because if we operate from a position of fear, where we try to lock down the doors and batten down the hatches, and this is the way we're going to retain our competitiveness, I actually think we're going to lose. It's not a winning strategy in my mind. And by the way, when we raised money for PayPal many, many years ago, Peter Thiel and I had a conversation about this, where many people who raise money are very secretive about sharing what their plans are, thinking that their idea is truly unique. And Peter had a great way of turning it around, where he said, listen, most of the time, there are 20 other people who have the same idea that you have. That's not the secret. I actually want to turn it into an advantage where I speak to as many other smart people as possible, because they're going to pressure test my ideas, and that'll help me sharpen what we do. And so instead of being closed and insular with our ideas at PayPal, we were very open. And it actually enabled us to enrich our own thinking and sharpen our own approach. And so that's the approach that I think is the winning strategy for us.
Jacob, am I about to cut you off? Did you want to?
Oh, I just think Roelof's feedback is incredibly interesting and valuable, and he makes really compelling points for open source software. And frankly, I think it's an area of tech policy that I find personally fascinating, but that's also incredibly important to get right. I myself have gone a little bit back and forth on that question, although I will say I have found the argument, while, I approach a lot of issues through the prism of national security. So I'll admit that I initially approached this debate with a little bit of a bias in favor of a know your customer rule, to try to create, not so much a walled garden, but create a speed bump to try to prevent, to try to create basic safeguards against Chinese companies getting access to our models. But I will say, look, the points that Roelof is making are really legitimate and valid, which is that even if you do create those speed bumps, they're probably going to get the technology anyway, just because, there's a very large body of evidence that shows that they're very effective at stealing technology. And so if you adopt that approach, you're essentially absorbing the cost of making it harder for your technologies to be global, while at the same time, you're not really getting the benefit of stopping your adversary from getting access to your technology. So it's a very compelling argument. And, and I think that hearing these types of pros and cons is actually incredibly useful for policy people to get that issue right. And actually, I'll add one more thing. And another bias I have is, as someone who grew up in Europe and have seen firsthand the way that Europe has often completely strangled its economy to death, I am a little, if in doubt, my default often tends to be just don't do anything, because no regulation is better than a bad one. And so, in these situations, I would actually probably err on, if the benefits aren't compelling and clear, then it's probably best to not, move forward with new regulations in the absence of clear and compelling evidence.
Well articulated. We're gearing towards closing here. I assume you both have hard stops, so I want to leave on closing statements from both of you. Perhaps either a message to Silicon Valley or a message to DC about how the other should better or differently understand or approach each other. Jacob, maybe 1 minute each. Maybe you'll start.
Well, I'm incredibly excited about the resounding enthusiasm that there is in both Washington and in Silicon Valley to engage with each other to solve so many different important problems that are important for the country. On the one hand, Washington needs Silicon Valley's help to make sure that we have the best capabilities in the world, but it also needs Silicon Valley's help to think through how to approach and address policy discussions and debates that a lot of people are having in DC, because ultimately we want to land in the right place for the sake of our economic prosperity, but also for the sake of our national security. And I'm incredibly excited to see that policymakers in DC are also, approaching that conversation with an open mind. They want to take the time to talk to people, hear the feedback, invite people into their offices, and they want to do this on a bipartisan basis. And so it makes me incredibly optimistic that the relationship between Silicon Valley and Washington has really turned a corner. And we have now a pretty solid foundation of trust to actually address and achieve some really historic progress on, investments in tech that are long overdue to bring new technologies into how the government is run to solve big problems, whether it's, better land management to solve, mega fires or make more efficient the allocation of healthcare benefits, welfare benefits. So many parts of the public sector could be modernized with better technology. And ultimately, in Silicon Valley, as Roelof, mentioned in his opening statement, Silicon Valley started in part with a lot of help from the US government. And so for the US government to better articulate what the North Star is, from a policy standpoint, will also be very clarifying for a lot of founders to know, where are the lines for policymakers. And so having those open channels of communication is incredibly important. And I'm happy we are coming to a much better place.
Thank you, Jacob. Roelof, any closing thoughts?
As an immigrant who is drawn to move to the United States because this is such a well-governed country, I've really come to appreciate how many sound policy decisions and the US Constitution have really provided the bedrock for this capitalist system to flourish and to be the best way to improve people's standard of living and quality of life. I mean, it really is remarkable what the United States has accomplished over the last 100 years. I think we have an opportunity to sustain that in the decades to come. It requires conversations in DC between those who make policy and those in industry. I feel privileged that Jacob has kindly created this forum for us to engage with DC and for us to have a voice in helping shape what we hope will be the best policy for us to continue US competitiveness for decades to come. Today's most burning topic is AI. There will probably be another topic in a few years, but it's, you need to have this open dialogue for us to have these conversations. When it comes to AI, I really think it's a generational technology. It is our generation's space race. We need to get it right, and I hope that we seize rather than squander the promise of this technology.
That's a great place to wrap. This has been an excellent discussion. Roelof and Jacob, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Jacob. Thank you, Erik.
Turpentine VC is a podcast from Turpentine, the network behind Moment of Zen and Econ 102. If you liked the episode, please leave a review in the Apple Store or rate us on Spotify. Hey everyone, Erik here. At Turpentine, we're building the first media outlet for tech people by tech people. We're the network behind the show you're listening to right now. We have a slate of hit shows across a range of topics and industries, from our AI and investing cluster of podcasts to shows that drive the conversation in tech with the most interesting thinkers, founders, investors, and influencers, like Econ 102 with Noah Smith. We're launching new shows every week, and we're looking for industry-leading sponsors. If you think that might be you and your company, email me at erikaturpentine.co. That's ERIK at turpentine.co, and let's partner together.